Kia ora tātou, nei anō te mihi ki a koutou I tēnei ata, mō tō tātou hui I tēnei wā. So welcome to our briefings for today. Got a pretty important one today, and it's great to have Te Whatu Ora staff in the room. Cheryl, nau mai hara mai, ki tēnei hui, ki tēnei whare, welcome along. It's great to have you here. So this briefing is in relation to the updated health statement that Te Whatu Ora put out on dust. What was it, last year? Or I can't remember, last year or the year before. And so we're going to go through that and look at how that's used in Environment Canterbury's consenting, planning and compliance practices. So really looking forward to that. Obviously, at the table at the moment, there's going to be a raft of staff coming to the table. But we've got Jess Burgess there at the table, our Senior Strategy Manager. That's $20. Thanks, John. No, just joking. And we've also got DeLuca Silva as our Strategy Advisor at the table, and of course Cheryl Brunton, Dr. Cheryl Brunton, a Medical Officer of Health for Te Whatu Ora. So that's who we'll start with, and Jess can introduce the rest of the team when we get going. So over to you, Jess DeLuca. Kia ora.
Thank you, Chair. As mentioned, this presentation is on Te Whatu Ora's health statement and how it impacts Environment Canterbury's consenting, planning and compliance practices. So a bit of background information. In early June, staff provided the Strategy and Policy Committee options for dust research and improving dust management in Canterbury. The committee had a number of questions regarding the recommendations and requested further information. And as a result, a decision was made to have the item lay at the table to allow staff to gather more information. So this briefing provides councillors with further information to support decision making. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear the word monitoring being used in various ways. So for example, the monitoring of polluted airsheds, and this is done by the council's science team. Monitoring of consent holders, and this is done by our compliance team as part of their work program, and monitoring of sites. This is done by the consent holder or applicant. This could be done before they apply for a consent or as a condition of the consent. So if you have specific questions regarding monitoring, it'd be useful if you could specify the type of monitoring that you're referring to. So the purpose of this briefing is to brief councillors on Te Whatu Ora's health statement and how it is used in Environment Canterbury's consenting, compliance and planning purposes. So in terms of the structure of the briefing, first we'll hear from Dr. Cheryl Brunton from Te Whatu Ora on the health statement, and then we'll hear about how it impacts our compliance, consenting and planning purposes. So feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We also have subject matter experts who will come and talk about their specific questions. And then at the end, we'll have wrap up and next steps. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Cheryl Brunton to speak about the updated health statement.
Thank you very much, councillors, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about this. I think probably a couple of things I'd like you to note around this slide is that the original statement was from 2018, the updated statement 2023. And one of the questions I've been asked to address is why the difference? And the simple answer is scientific evidence. Because science, and one of the ways in which science works is that we gather new evidence, we analyse that evidence, and we adjust our point of view depending on that evidence. So I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail, but that's the short answer. Things have changed, and particularly in relation to the particular pieces of work that are referred to in the statement, that is the World Health Organisation's work in updating their own air quality guidelines, and also the Health and Air Pollution in New Zealand study happens, which provides us with uniquely New Zealand data on this point. So essentially, new evidence shows that there is a strong association between exposure to dust and adverse health impacts, and the strength of that relationship depends on the frequency, amount and duration of exposure. Think of that as dose. if you like, and the location and distance from the dust source, which has something to do with things like intensity of exposure. One thing I would like to say at the outset, though, is that dust is probably an unfortunate term in this context, because I think we're all aware of dust that we might find a nuisance. So, for example, I think probably a good example in Christchurch is when your neighbour's burner is producing that sort of black smoke and it puts smuts on your washing or things along those lines. That's large particles. They are annoying from the point of view of visual amenity. They, as I say, they can stain things, get on cladding, get on other things like that. But in terms of health effects, they're not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is particulate matter, and particulate matter less than 10 microns, which is the PM10 fraction and smaller. And the reason that's important is those are the particles that can be inhaled into the lung. And as a rule of thumb, the smaller the particle, the further it can go. And some of those particles can also go further into the bloodstream, the very small ones. So that's what sets us up for thinking about what the health effects might be. So essentially, compared to 15 years ago, and our original statement was based on WHO guidance at the time from 2006. The WHO has actually said in its guidance in 2021 that compared to 15 years ago, when the previous edition of the guidelines was published, there is now a much stronger body of evidence to show how air pollution affects different aspects of health at even lower concentrations than previously understood. So I think that's one of the key and important reasons for changing advice. To inform the development of those updated guidelines, the WHO actually, before they produce guidelines, they undertake and commission what are called systematic reviews of evidence. And these systematic reviews, they actually publish them as well. So all of those data are out there, people can look at that. But there are a couple of the papers from that are particularly focused on particulate matter, and that's the focus of what I want to talk about today. So particulate matter can cause health impacts, either from long-term exposure or from short-term exposure. So there are effects for both, and those effects tend to differ. So essentially what we're looking at in the case of particulate and the evidence that we have around that now is health effects like increased all-cause mortality. That means death from any causes, so that's when you lump them all together. Cardiovascular mortality, so that's deaths from cardiovascular disease. Now that includes heart disease and also cerebrovascular disease like stroke. And respiratory mortality. And I guess probably it's very easy to see why you might think that respirable particles would affect the respiratory system, and they do, because we breathe them in, but they also have effects beyond the respiratory system. The WHO has actually concluded that long-term exposure to PM10 is causal, that is, the causative or likely to be, for lung cancer mortality as well. So the kinds of specific disease outcome I can talk about in more detail if you would like me to, but I really just want to alert you to the fact that it's actually very, very widespread. I think the other thing that's important is that the WHO's guidelines do not identify safe levels. There is no threshold for these effects. In other words, basically they occur in a linear fashion. In other words, the higher the dose, or the higher the exposure, the higher the likelihood of an effect. So that's for some substances, for example, we do have a threshold effect, what's called a no observable effect limit. There is not one for particulate and those health impacts. It is linear. Now, of course, even if we didn't have human activity, there would still be particulates, because particulates come from natural sources as well. I mean, some of those particulates and things like sea spray, dust that's coming off of the plane of a plane, and by that I mean the plane as in PLAIN, in windstorms and those kind of things. We know about that. So there is no particulate-free environment. What humans can control, and regulators like yourselves can control, or have some limitation on, is what I would use the term anthropogenic, in other words, particulate related to human activity. And that's all kinds of human activity that can generate particulates. It's the transport we use. It's the energy sources we use. I mean, this council particularly has a long experience around dealing with the impact of domestic heating on outdoor air quality in Christchurch. And this council has also done some very major and important things historically around reducing that burden within the community. So from that point onwards, in terms of, the sort of what can you do about it and what's it causing, is that in terms of the health effects, they are kind of agnostic to the source of particulate, in the sense that it's the presence of particulates that is the problem. So it doesn't matter whether they're natural or not. So, of course, having said that there's a linear relationship, that means the particulates we can't do anything about are probably still having some impact on people's health. But the particulates that we can do something about are the additive effect, and that's the bit where, say, regulation and mitigation can make a difference. In the New Zealand context, and I know others in the group of speakers will talk about the National Environmental Standards for Air Quality, and talk about those and the limits that are set in those, because they differ from the ones in the WHO guidelines. So I'll leave that to them to talk about. But in terms of if you were setting the NESAC today, I suspect that you would probably be drawing on the WHO guidelines, because the previous NESAC drew on the previous WHO guidelines to help set those particular limits. So that's kind of our rationale. That's the rationale for change. It's basically better and much more compelling evidence that exposure to particulates does harm to human health. The HAPPENS study, that's Health and Air Pollution in New Zealand, used New Zealand mortality, morbidity and data to model the impacts on health. And they produced, and I recommend it to you, this excellent website in which you can actually look at those impacts from the point of view of down to the level of a territorial local authority. So the predicted excess deaths, excess hospitalisations, those kind of things, from the level of a territorial local authority. That's HAPPENS 3. There have been 2 prior studies. HAPPENS 3 was published in 2022. So that is also a study that we took into account in amending the health statement, because that provides us with New Zealand evidence and New Zealand-based evidence around estimating the health impacts of exposure to particulate matter. Most of these health impacts, whether they're short or long term, are actually driven by the smaller fractions of the particulates under PM10, so closer to the PM2.5. So the smaller the particulate, potentially the more health impact. But essentially, most regulatory tools are around the PM10. And that's appropriate, because it's everything smaller than that. And it's not saying something between PM10 and PM2.5 doesn't have health impacts. It's just the health impacts are more or greater at a smaller particle size. So from that point of view, and thinking about the kinds of health impacts, it's not just mortality, as I mentioned, it's also hospitalisation. There are people in the community who are more susceptible to the health impacts of particulate matter. And again, I'm pretty sure most lay people would find it very easy to guess that they are people, for example, with asthma, people who already have a chronic respiratory disease like chronic bronchitis or emphysema, what we call COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So those people are particularly likely to be vulnerable to short-term excursions in air pollution. So short-term higher particulate, for example, causing them to have a relapse. And we actually do have data, and it is Christchurch data, it's going back a long way, but we do have data looking at the impact of the levels of particulate in the air in Christchurch and Canterbury, and hospital admissions to Christchurch Hospital, which supports that. But from short-term excursions, there's a slight lag, and then you see an increase in admissions from around those things. So I guess what I'm saying by that is we don't actually have to prove by measuring the actual health impacts that particulates are having an impact on health. We actually already know that, and we have a proxy for health effect, which is actually measuring the concentration of particulates from around there. So that's something I just want you to bear in mind in terms of things like, I'm aware that you've been briefed on, potential for research and things. The research is probably better directed at the particulate rather than, because the particulate is a proxy for health impact. And like I say, the happens can actually give you some modelled figures about what that health impact might look like. In other words, what could be done. That includes days of work lost, because if you have asthma and you get an exacerbation of your asthma, you may not be able to work. You may lose days at work. If you have a heart attack, which again is one of the things that can happen with short-term excursions, not just long-term exposure, you're going to be off work for a while. So there are both health and economic impacts, direct economic impacts in terms of the cost to health services and the cost to people and community from losing time at work. So I really would encourage you, I mean, I could spend the entire briefing talking about happens, so I'm not going to, but I really would encourage you to look at that, because it's the team who produce happens have been working on this type of study methodology for a number of years. It is international best practice, and they're extraordinarily careful about their data and how they do the model, and they also provide really, really good explanations of that. So it's a very open piece of science and research. It's also very painstaking and time-consuming, which is why it doesn't happen every year or anything like it. They need to look at large data sets, and so the data that informs the publication in 2022 actually comes from 2016 in terms of looking at the dates. And again, also there's some things I won't go into detail, but even things like looking at what the causes of hospitalisation are, that's not data that we could give you on a weekly or daily basis. That's data that you need to look at when things have been properly classified and coded. Same goes for death data, which is an even longer one. So there's sort of a rule of thumb there. Your death data is always about 2 years in lag in terms of accuracy.
I'm just wondering if we can get a link to that
Sure.
stuff.
Yes.
If that could be sent around, that would be really good. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's there. You can find it on a couple of sites actually. There's the Ministry for the Environment, but also Environmental Health Indicator New Zealand at Massey University. Massey's got the nice dashboard one that you can play with from in there. So I'll make sure that Dylanica and the others have those links for you. So coming back on that, coming back to the why. Why did it change? Well, it did. The next bit is what you're going to hear more of from council staff is what does that mean for Canterbury? And I've already said that, for example, the National Environmental Standards for Air Quality do not reflect this new evidence in terms of health impact, but they are the current standard. So that's just something to bear in mind. And as regulators, that is what is your regulatory standard. However, my view, and I know the view of my colleague, Dr. Pink, who was involved in the original statement, is that from the point of view of health impacts, we would, because the relationship exposure to particulate matter and those adverse impacts is a linear one, the more we can reduce exposure to particulate matter, the better, and from all sources. And that's, to say, what I know Council has previously done in the case of domestic fires. I know that there's also things happening nationally because you're aware that vehicle emissions are also a source of particulate matter. So, but I do know that this briefing is particularly been called in relation to quarrying, because that's been a controversial and difficult topic, and that residents and people who operate quarries are in a position where they don't seem to be able to agree. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to help in that. All I can say is that and did say when we had the opportunity to provide comment on the options paper that Council received about potential future research, to really make a strong argument that, in our view, from a health perspective, that more and better monitoring would be one of the best investments in terms of being able to look at health impact. And unfortunately, although the MOAT study, which I'm sure you've heard about and been briefed about, happened now some time ago, it was a very good study, but it didn't last long enough to be able to give you the kind of information that you particularly want about, in an area where there's a quarry, for example, what is the contribution to the particulate that is in the air from the quarrying activity, that is, that human activity, versus the natural background level. You're on the way to it, but never quite got there. So there are other ways to look at that. The advice that we provided is in a memorandum, which I believe I think was shared with councillors at the time, the memorandum we provided on the options paper.
Yep. Yeah,
I think
it was packaged up as part of the. It was on the lit review, I think.
Yeah, that's
Thank you.
and the lit review was particularly more around best practice in quarrying, which they are related but not the same thing, I think is probably the best way to put that. So in terms of, and this will be very brief, our broader work program and focus in relation to air quality, as you will be aware, the health system has undergone significant reform. The bit that I work in is called the National Public Health Service. That's made up of all of the former public health units, so your local public health units around the country, all of which were part of their respective DHBs in the old money. It's made up of that plus a number of national functions, particularly around things like immunisation and screening, so not directly related here. It would be fair to say that the whole of the system has not only had that particular perturbation, but the word that I don't think we're all very keen on, which is called a reset, which was a budgetary reset. So we're still finding our feet in terms of where things are being dealt with at a national level versus regional, and by region there I mean the 4 Te Whatu Ora regions, and at the local level. But for us, working in the National Public Health Service here in Waitaha, we have always and had a very long association of working within air quality, and that's at least partly contributed to by the air quality problems in Canterbury. So we've worked collaboratively and historically at a governance-to-governance level as well, particularly around the issue of the burners and wanting to make sure, as the ECAN Council of the time did, that regulating domestic log burners wouldn't have an adverse impact on people who wouldn't be able to afford to heat their houses, because being cold has also got unfortunate cold and damp has also got health impacts, and so we worked very closely at that time. We have also been working since 2017, don't quote me, but on a joint work plan in this area, where one of the areas of the joint work plan is air quality. So and although we were temporarily off the bench, so to speak, during COVID, we have really enjoyed in the last couple of years re-engaging with the regional councils within our particular rohi, and it is ECAN for parts of it. We also cover West Coast, so West Coast Regional Council we're also involved with, but also the territorial local authorities. And air quality is something that comes up even on the West Coast, because I had spent some time with the regional council there as they look to renew and review their air plan. So again, briefing them on things like happens and what that means, and showing them the West Coast data and talking about the particular sources. The West Coast has a unique issue in that it has only 2 air sheds. One is Reefton and the other is the rest of the coast. And as you can imagine, the rest of the coast is a very diverse environment in terms of both natural and human-made sources of particulate from around there. So that's the kind of thing, and we have already begun to engage around your own work around the air plan. So these are the sorts of things that we would do. So this is aside from the issue of things like formal submissions. So this is, a lot of that is, if you like, working upstream. And that's our preferred way of working. We use a term called health and all policies for that, but it's generally an awful lot more effective than making a submission and receiving a response on it. Although we still do that, but if you're wondering why we call it technical advice, that's because currently the Minister has made it clear in his letter of expectations we are not to make submissions to local authorities. Doesn't mean we can't work with you though, and we certainly want to do that. So essentially that kind of covers those last 2 dot points on the slide, which is really both what we have done and what we will continue to do around that. We also work with you and your staff on a number of other issues. I spent a couple of hours yesterday talking about recreational water monitoring, because we're very much a partnership approach with ECAN and ECAN Science around those kinds of things. So that's how we hope to work, in a kind of a no surprises way, but working upstream and working with your staff and doing things like this as well, which is being available to come and speak to and provide a health perspective to meetings. So I think I'll leave it there, but I'm very open to any questions or any more detail.
Got it, Cheryl. Thank you so much. Any questions from councillors? Councillor Southworth?
Thanks, Cheryl. I always love the science that we get, and thank you for your explanations. I'm interested in the sort of additive point of view or additive aspect that you've highlighted. I'm wondering whether we should, because I obviously accept that there are there's a natural background, but some areas will be more dusty than others naturally. And so should we, through our planning work, or is there an opportunity, I'm wondering, whether that could be justified from a health point of view, to essentially demarcate areas that are naturally more dusty and say, actually, we shouldn't be contributing to additive here because it's the additive component and the exposure on X number of days that has a particular health effect. And so, let's try and identify where are some areas where there's low natural dust, that therefore the human additive part doesn't tip it into here's an unacceptable level of impact.
In principle, that sounds like a really good idea. In practice, I think it would actually be quite a lot harder to define those things. And I think the other consideration that I would bring into that equation is that some areas that have not previously been dust prone may become so. And I'm thinking there are more along the lines of climate change impacts and things like, a riverbed that's full of water doesn't generate a lot of dust. A dry riverbed does. I mean, that's very simplistic. So in principle, that's an idea. I suspect putting that into practice would be a great deal harder. And it might lead to, and also some activities can only take place where they take place. For example, quarrying can only take place where there is material to quarry. From around there. So we can and have done things in the past around industrial zoning for impacts of things that had to have combustion as part of their activities and put them in certain places, or it's not so much particulates, but things that smell. We've put them in other places or contained them. I think that's the issue, is not just the activity, but it's how the activity takes place and what other mitigations might be required as well. Is probably more likely under the current rules. I mean, I'm very aware that probably we're all waiting to hear what the new version of the RMA looks like from in there. But under the current rules, those are the kinds of measures that would be possible. It would be harder to do what you're suggesting, and we sort of do it by inference, not just for air quality, but for other things, by having zones, activity zones like industrial activity zones versus residential and separation. And those kinds of things, but it's a good question.
Oh, sorry, Vicky. You've got another question.
So really, it's giving a distance to more vulnerable areas where you've got higher concentrations of people or particularly sensitive receptors. I'm thinking like hospitals and schools and things like that. Sorry.
Sensitive receptors is an important point, but would just point out that some things like asthma are incredibly common. I know with the West Coast councillors, I just asked them first to say, not to tell me, but to say, how many people in your family have someone who has asthma? How many people in your family have someone with chronic respiratory disease? How many have cerebral vascular disease? And by the end of it, there was no one left who didn't have sensitive receptors in their family. It's kind of, it's when you start to think of the broad brush thing, it is that. I mean, it's intuitively sounds like a really good idea. And I think children are probably the ones because, of course, they're going to have cumulative exposure. So if we can reduce their exposure in infancy, then there's, if you like, room for exposure as an adult.
Dion?
Thank you so much for that. I think sensitive receptors and sensitive activity is one thing, but it's where people are living there, sort of, having constant exposure is another thing. And I think that's what we're sort of getting to the crux of with the residents in part of our city where this activity has moved towards where residential exists, and they are 24/7 living in those areas. So there's those two elements, there's sensitive receptive people, but there's also that long-term exposure. And one thing I'm really interested in is, I don't think you really mentioned it, is RSC as well. And has there been any changes to the thinking around that? Now, it's very, very strong in Australia, and quarrying activities near residential, where residents live, is very strictly controlled because of RSC. Do we have any of that evidence around in New Zealand, or is any of your updated health impact statements started to look at that?
Dion, can you just tell us what RSC is, just so you know what it is?
Respirable crystalline silica.
Yeah, I got it. It's RCS. Sorry, that might be why
I've got myself. Yeah, no, I've got my head. Look, I'm dyslexic at the best of times, so there you go. I've just proved it to everybody.
I knew getting it. Respirable crystalline silica.
Microphone.
Respirable crystalline silica is part of PM10. It is, however, a specific. I mentioned just briefly a specific types of particulate with impacts and effects. In New Zealand, the problem of respirable crystalline silica is primarily an occupational one, and that's in the production of and both manufacture and working with engineered stone. The quartz component is the issue there. Now, your lovely engineered stone bench that's slightly, sparkly, that's what makes it lethal. That engineered stone is more than 90% quartz, in other words, silica. So what I'm getting at, that's why it's such a risk, and why in Australia, not so much quarrying activities, but why that product has been looked at, because there's a particular form of silicosis, which is the disease that's associated with respirable crystalline silica exposure, which is called accelerated silicosis. And this is where people who've been working that stone, often for very short periods, a matter of a few years if that, get a type of lung disease called a restrictive lung disease. Basically, the lung can no longer function in the way that it's meant to do to exchange oxygen, and it's not treatable or curable. You can do some mitigative effects, but it can be fatal. That's why I talked about that stuff's lethal. Wouldn't have it in my kitchen, but it's not a problem to you use in the kitchen. It's the problem for the people who make it and tool it and cut it and do all of those sorts of things. So Australia had moved ahead on that. The issue about what is the risk from respirable crystalline silica in quarrying activities, the answer depends on what you're quarrying and what the quartz concentrations and things are. And I am aware that in Australia there have been workers in quarries, for example, who have also developed this accelerated crystalline silica, but their exposures are a great deal heavier than are likely to be the case for any members of the public. And also the quarries they're working in, the background levels of silica quartz in the material are much, much higher that I'm aware of, and I think your staff have some information about this, than the materials that are actually being quarried at the alluvial quarries here. So yes, there's no doubt there's quartz, but it's about concentration. And the people most at risk from exposure to respirable crystalline silica are the people who work with it. So that would be the people who work in the quarries if they're not taking the appropriate precautions. It does, however, as I say, form part of particulate matter, of the smaller particulates. So as part of the picture, it's very definitely important. And certainly that's one of the aspects of the Moat study, is that if it had continued, we might have had a better handle on some of those things, even though it wasn't respirable silica specifically that was being measured for this PM10.
Another question that's around monitoring, and I know there's some specific monitoring questions that I could ask our staff, but you did mention monitoring. Do you think it's worthwhile for us to look at trying to invest in doing a monitoring program around the quarries and at what level do you think it would be appropriate? And do you think it's appropriate maybe to re-look at that Moat study, given it has been 10 years since we've done that? And is there any appetite for the Ministry of Health, Te Whatuora, to help us to design that and make sure that it's useful this time? And fund it, maybe.
Well, two things. One, I don't work for the Ministry of Health, so I can't speak for them. I am a designated officer of them, but I think what we talked about in our response to the research proposals was actually a continuous PM10 monitoring in accordance with the current regulatory approved methods. Now, we can get air quality advice. For example, I'm not an air scientist, you have your own from in there, but in preparing all of the materials that we have done for consultations with ECAN and things like that, we have sought that technical advice. That is not a question we had asked about the how many and where question. We did ask our air quality scientist consultant to comment on the options that were being put before council, and so that memorandum deals only with those options, not in that detail. But yeah.
Kia ora, Cheryl. Oh, the Moat report?
The Moat report as well. Do you think it's worthwhile sort of revisiting that potentially?
I'm not sure, and again, this is very much off the top of the head, so I need to qualify it, but I'm not sure that we're not talking about repeating it. We're talking about doing continuous monitoring as opposed to a one-off study, which Moat was intended to be. It just didn't go. If Moat had gone for at least a year, I think some of our questions might have been answered, but it didn't. And the next best option would be continuous monitoring.
I think that's what I picked up from you, Cheryl, is that more and better monitoring is the best value for money that we could do. And then you've also added to that by saying continuous PM10 monitoring. I definitely think that's a way to go, so it's really good to hear that. And obviously we could talk to our staff about that a little bit more. I've got Genevieve, John and Grant.
No, I'm like Vicky. I actually loves the science side of it as well. I'm a Dunedin study member, and so I'm just referring back to some of the studies that we've been part of as members, and one of them has always been progressively on dust and dust mites and how that affects later in life the susceptibility of getting things like silicosis from quarries and the likes. I'm just wondering, the baseline sort of data for a passive particle or particulate in the air, do you have sort of a fundamental sort of concept of what is the baseline in different areas? Like, no. So I definitely like the concept of having different designated areas for particular activities based on, I guess, workplace issues, based on occupational sort of asthma and the increase of that. And that could be, the district plan can set aside different areas for that. And I know in particular it does have that at the moment where particular activities, if they're no longer deemed appropriate, there are options for changing location of particular activities with evidence. Oh God, now I've lost my train of thought. I almost feel like coughing even talking about this dust issue. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah, I might have to come back because I've lost my train of thought. Thank you.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the conversation. I think I was part of the governance group when the Moat trial was put up, and I remember at the time it was over a timeline basically being the nor'west, the summer cycle, when we were getting those wind effects and trying to distinguish what was coming off the riverbed. And as a salmon fisherman, you could get yourself sandblasted in a river, whether it's the Waimakariri or the Rakaia, and just try to understand the difference between what was naturally coming out of that ecosystem and across the quarries. Yet more than happy for us to do further work and understand over the year. But I think my understanding was once we sort of got into a southerly or a northeast pattern, the issues were never as great. So it was that period of time with the nor'westers that were really sort of driving the dust through. But as I say, quite happy. What do you believe? So I guess you have answered it in a sense while I was thinking about the question. So constant monitoring upstream of or downstream of in different wind patterns to try and distinguish between what is natural potentially coming off the river and land as opposed to the effects of the quarry itself. Is that what you really are?
Yeah, essentially, and particularly because I am aware that some quarry operators already have monitoring, and that's information, but you really, to get a full picture of what things are going on, because I think you're really well aware of variation with particularly time of year and things like that, is the more data you have, the more you can say about those effects and how they do it. I guess, although Moat was around the nor'west cycle, if it had continued to the non-nor'west cycle, we would also have a fairly good idea of what was happening in non-nor'west periods about the components of the particulate and the potential sources of the particulate as well.
Thanks for that, because I think from looking at the graphs on my mind, it was really struggling to distinguish what was background versus what was coming out of the quarries at the time.
Yeah, and that could be very reassuring, or not, as the case may be. Yeah.
Thank you. Grant?
Thanks very much for this. My question's about the Health and Safety and Employment Act and occupational hazards for various industries. and I'm thinking of the silicosis, and how people do, so the construction industry, cement, sort of those sort of things. Are you satisfied that there's an adequate level of inspection processes in terms of that health and safety, so that there's a link between the health and safety of the employees and the management responsibilities?
That's really outside of my scope to comment because we're not the regulator in that setting. That's WorkSafe.
WorkSafe, yeah.
I am so old that when I first started working in public health, we did do occupational health, and the minister or the then Department of Health was the regulator, but that hasn't been the case for many years. So that the work around occupational exposure for things is done by WorkSafe. We really only get involved because accelerated silicosis is a notifiable disease. So we are one of the sources of collection of data. The same goes with diseases, some other diseases that are occupational in nature, but by virtue of the fact that the Health Act is more of an antique than I am, we still get those reports, even though the agencies that have to deal with them isn't us. So really, those questions are probably better addressed to WorkSafe.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Supplementary, the other thing that happens apart from those sort of dedicated things is in the agricultural sector, the dust from ploughing fields and those sorts of things. In terms of the notifiable situations, then do you in terms of the hospitalisation, the deaths, is the breakdown of those activities, is it very clear about how many people might die a year or whatever from certain occupational activity?
It's the data there are better. This often because after death there may be postmortems and things like that. But the contribution that, for example, dust in general exposures might make to deaths in the agriculture industry would be very difficult to ascertain. There are a number of much rarer diseases associated with inhaling certain types of things, but it's usually biological material and around particulates. We've got, there's this sort of cotton picker's lung and a few other fun things like that around there, but it's not something that in New Zealand, a lot of the diseases that are those particularly uniquely associated ones, we don't actually see a lot of them here. I mean, I think, referring to Councillor Swiggs's question, we did see silicosis in miners. I mean, I've spent all of the years I've been a medical officer of health being medical officer of the West Coast, and that was recognised as an occupational disease a very, very long time ago. It was one of the earlier ones to be recognised. But in agriculture, probably, again, getting off topic a bit, but things like deaths related to farm equipment, tractor rollovers, quad bike rollovers, and things like that. There's good data on those, and both WorkSafe and ACC have worked on programs around those things. So we have good data, and of course, because we have a significant farming economy, there are a lot of people potentially exposed to that. In terms of dust exposure, most of the situation for farmers, with dusty paddocks and things that's short-term exposures as opposed to long-term, so might well produce some impacts in the short term. And yes, over a life they would add up. More likely to be short-term exposure that's problematic there, rather than a long-term situation.
Thank you. Vicky and Dion, you had another question. Keep it short, please.
Yep. So, just to the last questions, a point would be that as a worker, then it's being informed about PPE. So there is an opportunity then to acknowledge, recognise you're about to enter into a dusty activity and then mask up. A question around the monitoring, and we're looking at talking about PM10, potentially also PM 2.5, but the angularity. So I just in my head was thinking about crushed silica, and that's a particular risk when it's angular, and there's a difference potentially there in terms of the natural dust which has been come down off the mountains and washed through the rivers and so on. It in theory should be more rounded, and stuff that's coming from quarries where it's gone through a crushing process and it's more angular. And I'm just wondering whether that's something that should be considered in terms of monitoring program, actually looking at the difference in the particles.
I'm not sure how much that would help, because the health data doesn't, although what I've presented with from WHO does not specifically consider that. I mean, in the elements of city dust back in the good old days when asbestos was in every brake pad, there was a lot of asbestos in the air around every one of our roads. Now that's something we have less of because of around that, but asbestos is one of those ones where there is a very specific relationship between particle type and damage, but not, and RCS, yes, as well, but as I think from my answer to Councillor Swiggs, the proportion that is likely to be quite small relative to the overall burden of PM10.
That it's the uncertainty. Like in theory, there should be more expectation of angular dust from crushed material than from the natural environment. So given that there is a link with that, where there is silica, if it's angular, it's more risky, creates more effects and more rapid effects, then perhaps that's something that should be sort of considered.
If we were regularly measuring the PM10 and aiming for that to be as low as possible, we would also be reducing that risk.
Yeah, I agree. The point you brought up, Vicky, is probably a good one, but has it been proven that that's a thing?
Yeah, okay. Yes, it absolutely has. Yeah. And my thinking again is that is, if it's directly linked to the activity and is different, then there's a different level of risk and exposure from the activity comparative to the effects of the natural environment dust because of that difference at particle level, then there is potentially something that needs to be thought through.
I think what we've discovered through some of the feedback around the lit review is that, the looking at the background dust thing is potentially like a red herring, because it's just going to be so hard to do. The best thing to do is a more structured network of PM10, continuous PM10 monitoring adjacent to and triangulating data from the quarries themselves. So that's because if we do that and we get a good handle on that, and reducing that would be the best thing overall. I think that's a place to start. And that's what Cheryl said earlier about the best bang for buck deal.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would like us to be working towards as well. In terms of the RCS issue, I know that when the study happened a few years, 2017, I think it was, or maybe around that time, there were some houses that were cleaned because of higher levels of that particular matter and PM10 as well. So, I mean, I think there is something there that we do need to consider. And the other question that I did have, though, is in terms of Regulation 17 of the NESAQ, how does that cumulative effect impact on the decisions that we or our commissioners need to make? And is there something, because it's very difficult for us to measure the cumulative effects, I'm worried that we're not picking up on those things. And is there any tightening of our regulations or advocacy to government to change the NESAQ potentially to recognise that? Because that, I feel, is one of the bigger gaps that we're facing.
Oh, just push a button.
My expertise is public health rather than planning law from in there, so I wouldn't want to comment specifically on that, but I do think that revising, as a general proposition, revising the NESAQ to be consistent with current public health and epidemiological advice would be a very good idea. In terms of that happening, that is, I'm sure all of us are aware, is a political process.
I think that is a good idea, though, from what you said today, that the NESAC was done before the new World Health Organization data and information. So I think that would be a good thing for us to write to the government about and say that is something
I would certainly support your advocating for that, because I think it makes sense to have regulation and standards that are consistent with the most up-to-date scientific advice, really.
Cool. So that's something we could consider at our strategy and policy meeting, potentially. Thanks, Cheryl. I know we've got a few other presenters to get on with, but I did want to, make use of the you being with us and let those questions be put. And I know that's put us a little bit behind time on the schedule here, but it's all good. Not your fault. I took that on. But we might move to is it Phil coming up to the table? I always think say stand or something, but it's not. It's just a table. So kia ora, Phil. And I know that you've got lots of experience in this consenting space for us, so you're a principal consents advisor, so over to you.
Kia ora, councillors, thank you. Obviously, I've got the five questions there. I'll probably just work through them in order. although I think some of them probably link back to things.
Bring your mic just a bit closer.
Just bend this.
Bend it
That's
towards
it.
you. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Sorry, I thought normally I'm loud enough.
Yeah, it's those online wouldn't be able to hear.
So I guess starting off, and some of this I'll probably flick to Lisa to talk about when she does the planning. But obviously, when consent is required is pretty much set by our plan. So that would be the Canterbury Air Plan. But when consent is required, it then follows the standard RMA process. I'm not going to go through that in great detail. But obviously that sets the thresholds for when we would need to notify and the considerations that we need to consider. And to reference Councillor Swig's comment about the NES AQ and Regulation 17, I can touch on that as well. In terms of what we look at, obviously health impacts are one of those things. It's a complex area of scientific modelling and things that I am not au fait with. Was never an air quality scientist, so I won't get into the detail. But that assessment is always site by site, proposal by proposal. It considers the whole range of where are the sensitive receptors, houses, curtilage, the location and the proposed uses around haul roads within those quarries, the prevailing winds, soil moisture, those meteorological effects, and those FIDOL matters. And I'm going to have to check my notes because I can never get them right. So that's frequency, intensity, duration, offensiveness, and location. All of that gets weighed up. A consent applicant is expected to provide those assessments when they come in. We then get those audited by people with the relevant technical expertise as well. For most of our large quarries, you have to also then consider those setbacks, and all of that has to be based on the best available information that we have. And I guess this will touch a little bit on the updated health statement. Is that health statement is really good at highlighting this as an issue, but in and of itself, it doesn't provide the depth of evidence that would be required in a consent process. What it does do is direct all the parties that they have to go and look at the evidence that would underlie that health statement. And so I guess in saying is, what is the impact of the updated health statement on our process? It's, well, that the health statement in and of itself probably doesn't have a huge impact, but except in that it directs us to go and look at the underlying information so that we can better inform, from an officer point of view, the ultimate decision maker on that consent about what are the likely issues. Sorry, I'm just checking my notes that I took while we were going through the previous aspect. One of the things I think, and I guess with my consenting authority hat on, it is a shame is not receiving submissions on specific applications. That's one of the things that ultimately for us in the consenting space is incredibly useful. But that also can then be picked up, obviously, and Lisa will talk about this when we do our plans. So thinking about where we locate things and where the triggers for consent are is probably where we'll get the biggest bang for buck in terms of then informing the subsequent consent processes. So I'll move on to the second point, which is where are we in regard to the quarry-specific addendum. And unfortunately, it's still in development. Quarries aren't actually a huge part of our consenting workload, particularly the large-scale quarries in sensitive areas. Because once a quarry's there, it's there for a long time, so we don't typically get them very frequently. And so I guess from a consenting point of view, we've concentrated on the things that are our bread and butter. So the ones that we currently have out, those specific addendum, are largely agricultural, water related. We're just about to come out with those related to construction and subdivisions and things like that. Quarrying is still on that list, and we're working our way to it, but we haven't done it yet, to be honest. In saying that, for the big quarries, we still have our pre-application service. We're still directing people to that, and in general, when we come to those big and quarries activities, there's actually a generally pretty good understanding, in my experience, from our industry about what we will require, and when we don't get it, we'll ask for it. So while we haven't done it yet, we are actively encouraging all those applicants to come and talk to us first, so we can make sure we get those really good assessments of the effects that we can then audit with our technical expertise. So I've kind of touched on this already about the updated health statement. That's that precautionary approach, making sure that we're delving into that best available information to support those decisions. But then having to translate that, obviously, to the specific situation and the specific locality that an activity is occurring in. That then informs the type of conditions that will go on consents. I realise I've jumped to the last point on the slide, because we'll be looking at, well, what are the setbacks that are required? What are the mitigations that the applicant is proposing, or that we will need to impose if the activity is to go ahead? Noting that's not necessarily, it's definitely going to go ahead. There's a whole bunch of things that need to go into that consideration. But that includes things like dust suppression, setbacks. I think there was Councillor Southworth raised the issue around angular dust from crushing. And we've seen that on some of the consents that have been granted, where any on-site processing of quarried material has a further setback from where they're just digging it up, because of those risks. And then with the discussion around the monitoring, more recent consents have had those dust monitoring requirements imposed. And that is now becoming more and more standard when these consents do go through, is that requirement to have ongoing monitoring with trigger levels, hopefully to prevent, so that if the wind is getting up and the dust levels are picking up, that potentially the works, they can get out the spray carts and get the dust suppressed, or potentially even stop work if the wind is too high and those dust effects are increasing. I guess I'll swing back to the thresholds about when we review an existing consent. Reviews are quite constrained under the RMA about when we can and cannot do reviews. Typically, it can be provided for in the conditions of the consent, and that will be very much a product of the consent and when it was granted. They do typically contain conditions that enable us to review when we can identify that there was an effect that wasn't anticipated or that requires further action. For discharge permits, that would be considering best practical option around mitigating dust. We can also review in response to new plans coming into effect. If there's a requirement, we've set a new air quality standard in a new plan, we can review consents to make sure that those consents have conditions that will enable them to, will require them to comply with those limits. For the existing consents we have, the difficulty we have is we have to demonstrate from an effects-based point of review as opposed to a plan-based review. We have to demonstrate that quarry is causing an effect that wasn't anticipated. And that's where the monitoring information is vital, because if we don't have that, we can't demonstrate the effect, which means we can't review it. So this comes, sort of that circular, we have to make the best decisions we can at the time with the information we have. And then once we've done that, we need ongoing information in order that we can potentially then, if we need to, trigger a review further down the line. The only other sort of time that we can review a consent is when it contains and the wording in the Act is inaccuracy that materially influence the decision. That's been tested on a variety of occasions. It's a really high bar, and it's not just everyone was working in good faith, we now have better information. It's no, you kind of misled the decision maker, and we've demonstrated that, and that's a really high bar to demonstrate. I guess the other thing just to point out with the reviews that would be worth councillors noting is reviews don't enable us, except in very rare circumstances, to cancel consents. It's about putting on additional mitigation. So that could be we could increase the setback distance or something like that, but you can't just shut down an activity because in hindsight we granted it 15 years ago, and perhaps we now with new information would go, well, we wouldn't make that same decision. So I think that's something to bear in mind when it comes to reviews. And the other part of that is with the reviews is you also have to consider the viability of the activity as one of those considerations. I think I've covered off all those points, and I'm happy to take direct questions through the Chair. But before I do, I just wonder whether I deal with the Regulation 17 of the National Environmental Standard. So Regulation 17 of the Air Quality NES requires the consent authority to decline consents when it is PM10. I'm sorry, I'm just reading off the page here. Would exceed the 24-hour mean under the schedule by more than 2.5 micrograms per cubic metre. Again, it's not my area of expertise measuring that. And it's within a polluted airshed, and it's beyond the site on which the activity is occurring. So this is we'd have to be measuring it beyond the edge of the quarrying activity. And again, that requires us to have that ongoing monitoring data or that data to support that prior to making a decision on a consent, which is really hard, and we're very reliant in those situations for a brand new quarry on the modelling, because the regulation also only applies when it's not an existing activity. If the quarry is already there, then this regulation doesn't apply. You can grant that a new consent to continue the quarrying operation that is there. It's really about when you're establishing a new operation that would generate those PM10 discharges.
Thank you, Phil. That was really helpful. Was that your question? Yeah, where you go.
Sorry, I do have a few questions. And one that you just mentioned, we don't have, obviously, for the Section 17, we don't have that data necessarily on beyond what's going on. And that's on us to get that data. And I'm kind of confused about why we haven't done that for as long as this issue has been going on. Section 17 has been around for quite some time. So is there any reason why we have not implemented the ability to gather that data that you just mentioned that we don't have?
I guess two things on that. One, I can't really answer the question about why we haven't done that. That's not sort of in my area of the organisation. I guess the other thing is I don't think you necessarily, because this is about establishing new quarries, you can't, I guess, this is kind of off the top of my head, so you won't necessarily know where you needed to monitor before you get the proposal, which makes it very difficult to have that data in advance. The way that you would do it in a consenting process would be you'd have to be reliant on the modelling of what is being generated. Is if you quarry at this location, what is you might have the background monitoring, and we noted that the points about that this is a linear thing, and who knows, it might already be bad and it might just make a bad situation worse. But you would then have to go, well, what is the additional level of discharge of PM10 that may occur beyond the boundary in these circumstances? That's getting into quite intricate modelling that I am not qualified to really provide comment on.
I appreciate that, and I think this is something we need to take away and think about, because you've sparked something in my mind about maybe we're not doing something we could be doing. The other question that I had, you mentioned consent submission feedback informing how things are going or how things will be happening, and then you mentioned in your next breath that, and sorry, I'm not picking on you here. I don't get me wrong. I appreciate what you're doing, but I've just got questions. And then you said that it's not our biggest workload, which infers that we don't have a lot of this. So we obviously won't be having a lot of feedback to inform how things are going. So the impact on those near this activity is disproportionate to the activity and to anybody else. So that didn't make sense to me, and I just think that we need to be thinking about that a little bit more laterally.
Yeah, and sorry, I probably didn't explain that particularly well. When I was talking about submissions, I was talking on a specific application. So when we are establishing a quarry, the submissions that come in are one of those considerations, and the more the technical information we have in those submissions around the health impacts, the more that the ultimate decision maker can take those into account. That comes back to when we do have these applications, if they are open, limited notified or publicly notified, then getting those submissions in is incredibly helpful for the ultimate decision maker. But equally, we don't have that many, and the submissions would always be on the specific proposal rather than the general one, which is why I sort of swung that this is really the submissions on our planning process might be a better way of informing where we set the requirement for a consent rather than relying on a consent process, which happen infrequently, and where we don't necessarily have the right level of submissions.
Would have been good if our RPS had gone through, because then we could have had hearings on the dust setback.
Yeah, I mean, we did put a 500 metre setback in there. It would be lovely if we could actually do planning at the moment as well, which we can't seem to do. One piece that I am confused about, and I just wanted to ask this question, is the Environment Court. We've made decisions, our commissioners make decisions, and I'm relating back to the Section 17 thing, and then the Environment Court basically quashes that and says, no, we don't, and I don't understand the specifics, and I think you might know the specifics. It's around that quarry out in Templeton, but then it changes and we don't necessarily have oversight over that, and that is really frustrating. Is there anything that can be done around those issues? And then I think you're talking about new plans and new plans making reviews. Are you talking about our plans, or are you talking about national environmental standards?
I might just touch on the last matter first. It could be our plans, or it could be and I don't have the Act in front of me, but it could also be a national environmental standard. So if central government released a new NES for air quality, then we could, I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head, but we could review to bring it in line with those new standards. In terms of the Environment Court, where there is an appeal to the Environment Court, things are generally resolved one of two ways. Either they're mediated, in which case all the parties that wish to can be part of that mediation, and that would include any submitters to the process, which is typically, and you reach an agreed outcome in terms of mitigation, and generally the court will sign that off. The other one is where you can't get to that point of view, and then the court will rehear as a de novo process that consent application. At that point, our role is exactly the same role we would have, except in a courtroom, which means you have far more lawyers involved, is to again present the evidence to support the council's position, whether something is okay or whether it's something that's not, and all the other parties can do the same. The court then takes the role of the decision maker, and they can reach a different decision and impose whatever conditions they consider as appropriate. Unfortunately, that's the way that process works. We have very little control of where, other than in terms of our ability to provide advice and technical evidence, where the court will ultimately land in terms of specific proposal.
I won't take up any more time, but I do think this comes back down to that first question I asked you about that outside that monitoring, which you just mentioned before, Chair. I think this is the critical piece that we're missing.
Kia ora. I'm just conscious that we've only got half an hour left, and we've still got two more speakers, Lisa on planning and James on compliance, which was scheduled for about 15 minutes each. I am keen to get to them because they are key parts of this. So I'm wondering if we go to Lisa, and if you've got a question about consenting, we can come back to it at the end if we've got time, or else we're not going to get through it. So all good. Thanks, Phil. So jot them down if you've got a question, and we can come back to it. So over to you, Lisa. And I reckon we've got a pretty good idea about planning and how that could help, because Phil's led in nicely about that he thinks it is obviously an ultimate way that this could be sorted. But over to you, Lisa.
Sure. So I've just got some speaking notes that sort of speak to each of those points as well. Just the first one, how we currently consider health impacts in planning. We've got an air plan that sets out objectives, policies and rules for managing air quality impacts, and it has an objective of managing ambient air quality so that it provides for the health and well-being of people. The plan prohibits discharges to air which have a noxious or dangerous effect, and then it applies national standards for ambient air quality and manages the cumulative impacts of home heating and other sources to reduce particulate matter in ambient air over time. The plan also sets minimum standards for permitted activities and standards for industrial and trade processes, so that they're not discharging beyond the boundary to in a way that's going to impact people who are exposed to that. For discharges from combustion, we have standards around, say, smokestacks that require sort of filtering and making flues high and fast, so that we're dispersing the particulate matter so that the concentrations don't get too high. And for dust and odour, we describe a scale and intensity that's acceptable in the permitted activity rules, and then if the activity is beyond that acceptable scale and intensity, then it goes into a discretionary activity status. And as a discretionary activity, the consent is required for that to take place, and in that consent process, we have full discretion around the scale and intensity of that activity. So we have discretion around things like setbacks, operating hours, and how the impacts of that activity are mitigated. The plan also includes some policy to deal with reverse sensitivity. And so reverse sensitivity happens where we've got some heavy industry located in a place that's appropriate at the time that it's located there, and then land use decisions are made which mean that sensitive activities move in around the sort of heavy industry in this example. The policy in the air plan says that if that happens and land use decisions have been made to allow sensitive activities to encroach on the heavy industry, then it's the heavy industry that we expect to reduce its impacts to meet requirement, well, to protect the health of those sensitive activities that have come in around it. So at reconsenting time, that would be, the onus is really on the industry rather than on the sensitive activities to be making way. So the next kind of point up there is, what is the impact of the updated health statement on that planning approach? Well, the statement would be considered as part of any plan review, of course, and I think, just like Phil said, what the statement does is kind of says that the issue that we thought we had in our last plan, the last time we reviewed the plan, it's probably a bit more serious now, and all of the evidence that underlies that has been updated, and we need to go back and have a look at that evidence that underlies it, and understand if we've got the plan settings right based on that sort of updated evidence. In terms of considering planning rule changes as a result of that health statement, again, we'd be looking at it as, what is the new evidence and what does that tell us about what the settings are, and are they appropriate? So it's not necessarily a case of picking a setback, saying 500 metres is a good setback for quarries, and then going out and looking for all of the evidence to support that. It's more saying, what is the evidence, what are the things that we have to manage, and then using that evidence to determine what those settings should be. So whether it's bigger setbacks, whether it's more mitigation requirements, maybe it's preventing activities from setting up in certain areas, it's those kind of considerations that we'd have to make in a plan review sense. Just got there an update on the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement, and it's been mentioned a few times. That's currently on hold, and we're looking at ways of progressing some of those policy positions through spatial planning and through the plan framework foundational work that we're currently working on. And then finally, there's a point there, what evidence is needed to support a 500-metre setback for quarry activities, and I'd probably just go back to that statement. It's not necessarily a matter of going out and finding evidence to support a setback. It's going out and finding the evidence to say what are the appropriate mitigations that we've put in place in those plan settings, and then running that through a plan process to see where it lands. So really, we'd need to understand if a larger setback is going to provide greater protection for sensitive activities, or is it just going to capture more of the smaller activities and require consents for a bigger range of quarries than we currently require consent for. And I think that's all of my notes.
Thanks, Lisa. One thing that you said at the start, I think our current air plan, it is up for review. I know that in another couple of years. And I think obviously it is going to be really relevant about the updated health statement, like you've said. So that's going to require us to take a closer look at that, because the statement that we prohibit dangerous and noxious dust or discharges, might have to be looked at again, because the statement's sort of saying it is dangerous where it wasn't before. It was just nuisance. So I think that's important. And I think the other thing, what I've seen from the air plan when I've looked at it, is that dust and odour. I think the focus is on combustion, and rightly so, with the history we've got here in Christchurch. But dust and odour probably needs a bit more of a focus in that in the plan, because you've noted that you got full discretion, so therefore there's not really heaps of guidance in the plan itself for some sort of triggers or work. So I think that obviously needs maybe a little look at. And the other thing that we've obviously already mentioned is the monitoring part of it. And again, under the air plan, we have air sheds, but most of them are focused on combustion, and there's not any, I don't think, that are focused on dust and odour. And we all know about the Bromley issues around odour, and then in our Yaldhurst sort of Hornby area around dust. So I think that's what I'm picking up, and Dion's picked up on it too, I think, around that continuous monitoring program that we might need to look at in those areas like Yaldhurst, where we've got known issues from our community, and we might need to commit to that for a few years to build the data set to then help us make better decisions. And if we started now, that might help us for our air plan in a couple of years. So I'm just going to put that out there. It's not really a question, just a statement. And I am keen, maybe, again, like last time, that we move on and we can get Lisa back to the table if we've got specific questions about planning. We'll get James up, and then we'll come back, and hopefully that leaves us like 10 minutes or 15 minutes to ask questions of all the presenters. Is that good, people? Thank you. So kia ora, James. So James is here on looking at compliance. So over to you. And you're our team leader for compliance, so kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. Current engagement activity and approach to the quarry industry. We meet regularly with the quarry sector on a range of issues, dust and groundwater quality as well. Probably to put in some perspective, we have got all the quarries are priority consents for us to go monitor, so they are monitored regularly. That is off the back of the moat study. We also monitor, we've got a new monitoring program for all the industrial stack emissions as well. So we've got those on the top of our list as well. The quarry conditions are largely offensive and objectionable beyond property boundary. As a result of the moat study, and I was one of the people who helped commission that back in the late 19th century, that resulted. One of the things we did there, just to give you some context around the 500 metre thing. Part of the moat study, we did a linear distance monitoring, and that was just on total suspended particulate, not on PM10, because it was a cost issues there. It was as a proxy, and we found that at 500 metres there was no distinguishable difference between levels of TSP we were finding there in relation to the control site we had. So we did have a control site, and when we got to 500 metres away from the quarries, we found there wasn't any appreciable difference. So that then resulted in some of the new consents had conditions on them that if they were closer than 500 metres, they had quarry boundary monitoring put on there. Possibly one of the other issues of the 500 metre issue was the Victoria EPA standards were bandied around quite a lot back in 2017, 18, I think that was that when we did the moat study, wasn't it? The Vic EPA 500 metre setback was that if a quarry was being proposed that was closer than 500 metres, it wasn't permitted, and they would have to get a resource consent with the equivalent of a resource consent for it. Not that it was prohibited at that stage. I haven't checked since then. So your field staff do go out and monitor the quarries. They are on our list. We do hold the quarries to the MFE guideline, best practice guideline on monitoring and assessing dust. They have developed their own code of practice, which has the MFE guidelines as a minimum level, and we do hold them to that. And we have response to dust complaints to the pollution hotline as a priority issue. So when they come through, they're given priority. I think that's where we're at in terms of how we're responding and how we're working with the quarry sector. At the moment, our compliance approach hasn't changed because quarries are high priority, quarry complaints are high priority, and the industrial stack emissions are something that we have a work program built in place.
Thanks, James. Just a question from me around sort of the monitoring side of it. So as I understand, like you said, some quarries have got monitoring sites, little wooden things, I've seen them, on their properties. And then how do we get that data? It's not live, is it?
No, that comes through into a portal to us and has to be calibrated because the way the dust gauges are set up, you have to calibrate the information that comes in. I haven't checked that recently. Last time I looked at that, there were no breaches of the PM. That's on a PM10 equivalent, like we used to have we did have for our airshed monitoring in Christchurch. It was the same limit.
Do we get to have some input into where they get put?
Yep, they would be written into the consent conditions where they're a consent condition. And in actual fact, we went back to the quarries and said, following the moat study, and said, if you haven't got because none of them had boundary monitoring conditions on their consent, we said, where their conditions said you should adopt best practicable measures. We had legal advice from our in-house legal team and said that could now be meant to interpret boundary monitoring if you have a dust activity closer than 500 metres to a sensitive environment, a house. And they all put dust gauges on their property boundaries where that dust activity was close to more than 500 metres from it.
And do we, because one of the mitigations and the conditions I've seen in some consents is obviously wind speed, certain wind speed, then you've got to apply water. Do we measure the water that they use during those events? So when the wind level is triggered in a consent, do we get alerted to that? And then do we get alerted when they actually do their mitigation?
From my understanding, we don't have alerts. We don't have a system of alerts coming through. But when our staff, hot northwest days, you will see that the quarry monitoring staff will be lacing their boots up and heading out. The same as our stormwater monitoring officers, you'll see them get their weather gear on when it's starting to rain. So it's reactive.
Cool. Dion.
Just one thing on that particular monitoring thing. That doesn't apply to monitoring outside their environment, does it? And that's where the again, that's where I'm coming at with this Section 17 and the NES AQ, because that's inside their boundaries, not outside, so we can't use that data for that level of compliance, or that part of the compliance when it looks at further consents down the track or any other activities.
That would be a science question to answer that, but I would imagine, and I think the chair touched on this earlier, that we could certainly utilise that boundary monitoring from the quarries to help fill in the picture, and they're more than willing to share that information.
Yeah, I think it's the issue is it's inside their boundary. We need stuff outside the boundary to comply with that Section 17 thing. So I'm going to take this away and think about this further. But the only other question I did have for you was a number of the community members there's two questions, believe that the monitoring equipment and the location that the monitoring equipment has been put within those quarries is insufficient to capture the effects that they believe that they're seeing. And the other question is, I'll leave it with that one actually, that's the most important one.
Well, in response to that, we did have our air quality scientists look at the gauges they were using and the location of the gauges, and they were comfortable with the locations of them, so we took advice from that from science. Yeah.
And the other one was, again, there was, with one of the quarries, the consent condition that we applied through our commissioner was that the information would be live streamed, and then the subsequent conditions through the Environment Court proceedings got rid of that, and that really frustrates me. So, I mean, I don't know what we can do about that because we don't have any control over what the Environment Court and those mitigations or those negotiations do, but I want to highlight that is something that really frustrates the bejesus out of me.
Thanks, Dion. Any other questions for James? Yeah, Grant?
No, mine's more probably consenting.
Oh, okay, cool. Any others for James? And if not, we'll get some of the other... Yeah, Vicky?
Yeah, this might be more... I'll ask it to James, but I suspect it might not be an immediate answer anyway. I'm just thinking about in terms of dust and thinking about my experience of like how the wind whips things up and moves things around. In terms of just thinking about sound, which is another thing that moves. It's not always just on a linear flat plane. And so how is our monitoring capturing this that potentially could get picked up, whipped up, taken over the top of the boundary at a higher level than if we've just got something on a stake at like 6 foot high? Do we test also at the nearest receptors, for example, that have got the ones that would actually get the effects?
So the short answer is no now. But when we did the MOTE study, as I said, we did that linear series of TSP, total suspended particulate monitoring gauges set back. You're only as good as the equipment and the practicalities of what you can do. So they are at ground level or 2 meters above ground level, but you're hoping that you would capture. And it was a fairly linear regression of dust we did see. But you're right, and odour and dust are the same things. They move around and they twist and they change, and they're quite hard to assess.
Cool, thank you. Genevieve?
With regards to compliance and monitoring, have we considered actually plugging into some of the WorkSafe programs where on-site monitoring of workers, occurs? I've just looked online, and some of the dust monitors that are personally on their bodies are live real-time data, including photographic sometimes, and it's reasonably priced. And I'm just thinking outside the square of how you can plug into some sort of research and you can sort of uplift it or use it willy-nilly to support our own research and data. It just my big concern, I guess, is it's all driven under sort of national standards, of which it's sort of like it's all based on guidelines, and it's not robust enough for what we need. I'm sort of going down a rabbit hole, but I guess for safeguarding people and communities and even workers on site, if consent is only good as conditions, but then consent under a guideline sort of process is also, it's not robust enough for, I guess, the repercussions of what it could do in the future, considering the extraction industry that's forming at the moment, as well as on top of quarrying, I guess, mines and the likes.
I think I would, in response to that, I would say that when we did commission the moat study, we looked at a whole bunch of different things, to try and prove or try and shed light on what we were trying to look at and find out if there were effects and at what level those effects were. There was a large and significant number of monitors and different types of gauges to try and get to what you're getting at. What are we looking at? Is this a significant level, and are there health effects as a result of that? We did respirable crystalline silica as well. And they had to be sent off to Australia to get analysed. There was a lot of money involved to try and get to what you're talking about. So our science team helped us an awful lot in there. So I would defer back to science because that's their area.
I know that when we got the additional money for monitoring, the team did look at some other monitoring devices. Can you tell us what happened there? Because in the end, I know that they weren't bought or whatever because they proved not to be that useful. Can you tell us about that?
No, I'm afraid I can't. I know that we did take on additional staff.
Can anyone in the room tell us? Thank you. Sorry.
Kia ora. Angie Scott, I'm in the science team. So I'm not sure exactly what monitors you're referring to, but I guess just talking about in general about monitoring, dust is one thing that's really, really, really hard to monitor, unfortunately. Whereas things like PM2.5, we can use quite cheap sensors even to measure that are give you a pretty reasonable results. But with dust, it's a lot harder, and we have to be very, very careful about the instruments that we select and that we use, because sometimes they're influenced by factors like relative humidity. And some of the instruments that are out there, they're almost like random number generators, like they just don't match what our regulatory instruments give at all. So you do have to be very, very careful about the instruments that you use.
Yeah, because I remember when we were looking at that, I think there was some devices that were tested or looked at, but they proved not to be useful. Sort of like
During the earlier dust program over the last few years, we did look at. I think we must have had maybe 4 or 5 different instruments that we ran alongside our regulatory instrument, and we didn't really. I mean, there were some that were okay, but then there were others that you would have to apply a factor to try and get it to match the results, and of course community don't like it when you have to do anything like that with the data. So we didn't actually find anything that we said, yes, this is a great cheap instrument that we can put out. And I think that's the thing that you need to keep in mind when thinking about monitoring and establishing permanent monitoring, is that it could be quite expensive.
Yeah, but the devices that the quarries use, they're all good. Like I heard James say that we've been and checked the locations and we're satisfied that they are good.
I think that they were fine at the time. I don't know now, and I wasn't involved with that work, but I know that certainly our air quality monitoring people were involved with that work and made a number of recommendations about what could be used and where to locate the samples as well.
I suppose my question would be, if we were going to do our own network of monitoring sites, what would we use? And I mean, that's probably a question we need to sort of come back to you with, I think, in terms of that's probably where what I've heard today is an important thing for us to consider.
And I think if you're looking at a regulatory quality instrument, which is what is used to compare against guidelines and standards, the ones that we're using are like $80,000 to $90,000 each.
Each, yeah. Once off, and what about operating?
Oh, yeah, and there's operating costs and all the rest of it, yeah.
Thank you. Did anyone have any questions for the other presenters as well? And so thank you, Angela.
Great.
That's great. Grant? Tell us
for Philip.
For Philip, yeah, cool.
Philip, my question is related to your comments about the difficulty of first of all assessing an application without sufficient pre-data material, and then this process of working out mitigation or conditions or whatever. Are there situations, I'm thinking of the precautionary approach to this thing, because it sounds like it's not a complete science in terms of your comment about it's a site-by-site assessment, and this question of Section 17, and I'm not familiar with that. But are there situations where you could say as a consent condition that, because am I right in that the land use activity is consentable through the territorial authority? So if that's the case, then part of our conditions, for example, could be to say that no actual physical construction work could take place for a period of time while a monitoring process takes place for a precautionary thing. Maybe it's 2 years or whatever. So I'm just thinking outside the square a bit in terms of the mitigation. Sometimes we talk about setbacks with planting and vegetation to provide that filtering. Well, if it's a new site, there's not going to be anything there. So all of those sorts of things. So if you could just answer that.
Yep. So whether a territorial authority requires a land use requiring is really will depend on their specific planning provisions. The RMA in and of itself is permissive for land uses outside of rivers and lakes. So the council, with the district council or city council, would have to write its own specific rule saying, no, you need to consent. In regard to your second point about whether we could require pre-monitoring in terms of getting background data, yes, that's something that can be done and is in some, and I've not specifically got any specific consent in mind, certainly not near discharge, but certainly for some activities generally related to water, there's quite often requirements to do baseline monitoring, whether it's ecological surveys or anything like that, before you do the activity, so you can assess change, or whether you need to establish setback trigger levels or anything. So yes, it could be done in that situation where probably in a hearing process. And so then it's obviously also contested, and you'll have the decision makers will have to weigh up the council's position of, look, we think you need to have some extra baseline monitoring, and here's why, and here's the evidence that we have presented to support why we think that's appropriate. And the applicant and submitters and everyone else will also get to present their reasons why it is or is not appropriate. And then the commissioner will have to weigh all that up, and then they will ultimately come to the decision. So yes, we can totally. If there's justification for it, we can totally put that forward. From a consenting point of view, we would be reliant on our technical evidence to justify why it is appropriate in this instance to impose those requirements.
Hang on, Grant.
Quickly supplementary. So
if it's quick,
that's potentially the importance of going down that track of the notification process. Public notification gives a broader perspective for people who possibly, rather than the limited notification.
Yeah, although we can't dictate that, Grant. No. Yeah. Obviously, applicants can volunteer that as well. But Robin, I know you had a point about the Regulation 17. Did you want to come and tell us about that?
Yes, I just wanted to clear up the. It sounded like we were looking at Section 17 as providing a duty on council for monitoring, but Section 17 is around the applicant providing enough information at the application stage as to that modelling, and then. So I'm just. Were you on that view?
I don't think we're saying that it's a duty on us. I think what Dion was saying is that it's part of the wider picture. Like, we're never going to be able to implement Regulation 17 or no one is, because there's never any data before. That's what we heard before, especially in a new area where there's a new quarry, because that's what Phil said. It has to be a new area and it has to be within a polluted airshed. But I think the wider point that we heard earlier on from Cheryl was that the best bang for buck on any of this is probably a dedicated monitoring program to build data to help us understand better, because at the moment we don't have that. And the moat study was one thing that was done in 2017 that's tried to help us, but as we've heard, it wasn't done long enough. Potentially, there are issues with it. We've heard that from our community too. Even though it was a good study, could have been more useful, and so that monitoring is probably the best thing that we could look at, and I think that's where my head's at, and I think Dion's as well. So, yep. Claire?
So in terms of the coming up paper that this briefing is about, the principle that the onus is on the consent holder for that section was the principle that we applied when developing those options. And option 3 is about having a permanent monitoring site. The scope that we were given, because when we're given a scope to work on and it said research, that was not the ambient air quality NESAC permanent monitoring, which came through the Te Whatu Ora advice, but because of the scope we were given from the wording of the decision, you will see that that wasn't one of the recommendations, but option 3 does have that permanent site as a recommendation, but it doesn't have a location for it. So I thought that might just add in this discussion and helping your understanding for when you come to that future decision.
And I think, the scope, I get all that stuff, but, the feedback we did get from Te Whatu Ora during the lit review is pretty important, and I definitely go back to that often and have a look at what was said to us, and I think we do need to take it into account regardless of whatever decisions and words we came up with in the room here, because we, you could argue were we informed that well, or did we put the words together, try to cobble something together? So I just think it's really important that we keep looking at that space. I know we're almost out of time, but David, you haven't asked a question, so happy for you to ask one.
Correct me if I'm wrong or I missed it earlier, but a consent a while back had an issue with taking use of water with dust suppression. Are we facing issues going forward with taking use of water where dust suppression is going to be a problem?
Good question. I mean, that case is still live, is it? The appeal period finished?
Yes, the appeal period is over and it wasn't appealed, so the ruling stands.
Cool. Any response for David? It's a good question, David. I mean, it obviously has raised something for that particular quarry and that particular site.
Kira, I'll do my best to answer that. In terms of over-allocated catchments or fully allocated catchments where you can't apply for new water, yes, people won't be able to apply for taking use permits for dust suppression. That doesn't necessarily mean there aren't other ways they could suppress dust or that they could source water. They could, as an example, they could, if they're run multiple quarries, they could potentially transfer water from one of their quarries to another quarry. So, yes, it's correct that they won't necessarily be able to get new water, but there may be other ways that they can deal with the dust issues.
Yep. Water is the most convenient way to have dust suppression. It's not the only way, but definitely the easiest way. Thank you. I think there probably were some other questions, but I am conscious of time, and you can make a final.
Very, very brief. No, there's quite cool data actually during COVID lockdown that gives a very good ambient picture of what was going on around sort of 2021. So, it,
True.
Supersedes the 2017 sort of information.
Cool. Thank you. Dion?
All I just want to say is thank you for coming. Thank you, Cheryl, for coming as well. I think this has brought up a number of questions in my mind that we'll pick through, but I think it's good to sort of get this, staple this down. And the one thing that I really want to hit on is we need to be thinking about that non-combustion related anthropogenic discharge, not just dust. I think that's what we need to be thinking about, and our plans need to reflect that. But when we get the chance to do our plans, that's what I want to see.
Yeah, and I'll reiterate that thanks to the team for bringing all the expertise to us today. It's been really good. Thank you, Cheryl, so much for coming from Te Whatu Ora. I know that to understand the health statement's been so much better having you tell us about what's behind it and how that's changed, but also bringing up that issue around the NESAC and how it's sort of out of date. So I think that's something for us to follow up on. I'd like to see a recommendation about that, to be honest. And thanks, Jesse and the rest of the team, DeLuca, and Phil, Lisa, who else spoke to us, James and Angela, Claire. Thanks so much for all the work to bring this to us today, and definitely some food for thought. Jesse.
So just to round you out and not to hold you up any further, but we have the 10th of September Strategy and Policy Committee meetings. So we have the paper laying on the table there with a number of recommendations. We'll take the feedback from today's discussion and all the good questions that have been asked and hopefully answered for you as well. There's some key points that I've absolutely taken from the discussion today. So we'll have a look at those recommendations as they sit on the table at the moment. I might meet with you, Chair, and Councillor Swiggs, Deputy Chair Swiggs, and Councillor Southworth as the Chair of the SPC committee, and we'll work through where we get to so that we can make that work through as easy as possible as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thanks, team. Thanks again. Kia ora.